Welcome to Part of Politics, where we prepare you for your next political conversation. I'm Jeronimo Cortina, Associate Professor at the University of Houston, and Happy New Year.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus, a political science professor here also at the University of Houston. Thanks for hanging out and talking politics with us on what's a pretty exciting, honestly, couple of weeks that we've been off, but also really an important year to come. So we're going to spend some time this week talking about stuff to watch for in 2024. There's a lot going on and probably a couple things that we won't have anticipated, but we will talk about at least the things that we know are going to be on that list. One thing that did, of course, come up this week was that we had previewed the debate and conundrum about having a final budget deal. Happily, that seems to have paid off. Everybody had a little break. Maybe, they got a chance to decompress a little bit. Maybe they like what they got for Christmas and had some champagne at New Year's.
And then ended up at the same place.
And literally agreed to the same thing they agreed to 6 months ago. But you're exactly right. Congress has basically agreed in principle to the spending deal. The top line numbers have been agreed to by the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and the Speaker of the House Mike Johnson. But as you say, this basically is the same structure that Kevin McCarthy had put into place. And you have to imagine that he's probably spit out his champagne on New Year's Eve thinking, we had this deal and I got kicked out because I was perceived to have played too closely with the Democrats. So tell us a little bit about what this plan looks like and then what you think it means in terms of where Washington is on this compromise question.
Well, it's the same thing, right? So basically what this plan does is replicate the McCarthy deal with the Biden administration in terms of providing funding for the government to operate, which it's always a good thing.
Yes, we need money.
One of the things that initially were in the deal, right, or the trade or the horse that they were going to trade was immigration and Ukraine. We're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. Right now, those things are in a separate bill or separate discussion, negotiation, whatever you want to call it. So it's going to be interesting to see because, as you said, yes, they shook hands and, in principle, right? In principle, we have a deal.
Yeah.
If that deal materializes or not,
they still have to hammer out the actual language. And that's where you might see some conservatives say, let's take a pause here because Speaker Johnson came to the office with the intention of being a fighter. He was going to be the conservative stalwart that McCarthy, in theory, wasn't. But now here he is playing nice with the Democrats, giving the White House more or less what they want and, averting a shutdown, which I think would have hurt Republicans anyway. But some Republicans don't see it that way. So this deal effectively is full of winners and losers. I want to get your take on this. But you could make the case that Johnson can say that he and the caucus won. They got cuts to IRS funding. They got cuts to COVID funding. That's what they had wanted. They were able to secure $16 million in additional cuts, which is not insignificant. That's $1 billion with a B. It's a lot of money. So they can basically claim that they tried to trim the budget, and they did. So would you consider him a winner in this, or do you think the conservatives are going to be really mad about the principle of the agreement, but also that he didn't fight harder to get, more cuts?
Yeah, I guess you can see it that way too, but also you can see it the other way. And the other way is you're not doing enough. And especially for the group of conservatives within the Republican caucus, right? And those are going to be the ones that are going to be at the end saying, yes or no. So to me is, they gave them a little bit of crumbs here and there, but I don't know if that's going to be enough to appease their appetite for significant cuts, right?
Barely enough to sponsor a good burp, as we say in Texas.
Exactly.
They want more. And people like Chip Roy from Texas want more. And they say, look, you were a fighter in the caucus. You talked big like you were going to challenge Biden. And now here we are agreeing with them on this stuff. And although I frankly think that some deal had to get done, there's just no upside to a shutdown. The fact is that they didn't get everything they wanted. And they're going to have to probably redouble their efforts to fight on other issues like the border issue, which we'll talk about in a second. So I think that's a problem. But remember, Johnson's in a tough spot here, right? He's new to the office, so he has very little capital on this. He doesn't know how to make deals. That's something you have to learn over time. He wasn't part of that leadership structure. He has such a small margin of error here, right? The number of Republicans is dwindling like almost literally by the day, right? So that's a real problem for him. And so he really didn't have a lot of options here. And so in that sense, do you think that, on a curve that he was successful, or do you take the Chip Roy route and say, you know what, we were mad?
Based on history, based on former Speaker McCarthy, I think, he's not a win.
Yeah, not a win. Not enough of a win to be able to say. But maybe he can get a win on something like border security, right? There's been ongoing bipartisan talks on this issue. And like you said, the chambers have basically agreed that they're going to partner together the border security plan with the Ukraine funding package. Right. Obviously, the White House is in some political danger on the border issue because you still have this context where there are, thousands of people pouring across the border daily, and this has become a real international issue. Yeah. Now, obviously, we live in Texas here, the epicenter of where this is happening. Greg Abbott has made this a major political issue and has ruffled the feathers of all of the creatures, big and small, and other mayors of big cities whom are receiving a lot of these migrants whom the governor in Texas here is busing to other places are pushing back. They're begging the Biden administration to do something about this. So there's a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to do something politically. This is an issue which Republicans can win on, and they may be very well winning on it right now. It also divides Democrats, and because of the kind of complications like we've talked about over the last few months, this is an issue that potentially could haunt them in the election. So give me your take on like where this could lead and what the kind of best outcome is for each of the different players. Best outcome for Biden, best outcome for Republicans.
Oh boy. Well, I mean, the problem with the border is that immigration per se is a very complex phenomenon that cuts across many other different policy domains. Yeah. On the one hand, there is a need for labor, for instance, right? Yeah. Here, qualified labor that would go and, it's willing to work on the fields, et cetera, right? So there is this demand for labor, and we have seen it, that some positions have not been filled because workers here, they don't want to work on that particular industry. Mm-hmm. And then you have, push phenomena, especially in Latin America, countries that have been, having significant problems, right? Mm-hmm. When you look, for example, at the case of Mexico, you have seen that Mexican migration to the U.S. has basically go down, right? Because Mexico is not doing so bad as in previous decades, right? So that's one problem with immigration. Yeah. The other problem is our immigration system. And our immigration system, both Republicans and Democrats agree, it's completely broken, 100%. The immigration dockets in immigration courts are up to here. Yeah. They cannot simply process as many asylum applications. We have laws that determine how asylum seekers need to be processed, so on and so forth. Yeah. So that's a problem. Yeah. And then obviously there is the political problem. Yeah. Republicans arguing, this is chaos, we're being invaded, so on and so forth. On the other hand, Democrats saying, well, this is just basically, Republicans do not care about human rights, so on and so forth. Yeah.
It's hard to ignore the imagery around it, right? Where like you're seeing a lot of the kind of grouping of the border and people are climbing over fences. And it's hard to know in a world where we live in if it's true or not and if it's happening in real time or if this is something that happened 6 months ago, right? But it's still meaningful politically. And so even if it's not correct and even if you can kind of parse these numbers in some way that makes it better for Democrats, I still think it's a problem for them and they're going to have to deal with this.
Oh, yeah.
And the problem is like they're kind of looking for a bipartisan solution in a Washington that doesn't deal well with bipartisan solutions, right? Yeah. We've had the least productive Congress in like 20 years that just passed. So getting something and anything passed is really hard. And they're hitting some snags on things like tighter standards for asylum seekers, expanding expedited removals from the interior, and giving the president what they call parole power, the ability to effectively admit full classes of migrants on an emergency basis.
Right.
So these are some really thorny political issues. Right. And the numbers themselves could probably be worked out, but obviously Republicans have dug in because they can use what they see around them and the politics of it as leverage to be able to force the Biden administration to swallow something they don't want to swallow.
The question here, or the first premise, is that you cannot have immigration, comprehensive immigration reform, period.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist.
They're going to incrementally move
exactly.
That's the best they can do.
What Governor Abbott has done very successful, right, and perhaps this was an unintended consequence, right, was to put pressure on the Democrats, right, especially on the White House via Democrats.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right.
And that
it's a stroke of genius in a way, right?
Yeah,
like,
it is. Yeah. I mean, to tell the truth, it is.
Maybe it was a risk they took it, like thinking maybe this would happen this way, but it happened. It happened the way that you describe it.
Right.
And that pressure is real. And so
exactly.
the Biden camp can't just sit around and do nothing, right? To say, like, we're going to try to wait for the Senate to work a deal, because that has to be something that they're involved in. And they really have to be at the front of this because it's a liability for them.
So, I mean, the Biden administration has one option and one option only.
Yeah.
They have to come out with a proposal, very clear, in the sense of giving something to what Republicans want and then put them on the spot.
Yeah.
Like, you want, to take away parole pardon from the executive, fair enough, it's out.
Yeah.
What else do you want? And then start the negotiation process, and then if they want to sit to negotiate, because it is a reach issue that brings voters to the polls.
Yeah.
So if you try to take away the oxygen from the room and saying, I'm willing to sit with Mike Johnson tomorrow.
Yeah.
Come to the White House.
Be
Bring
more
your
proactive.
people tomorrow.
Yeah.
And we'll sit down and discuss these things.
I agree. There are two problems. One is that, like, presidents hate giving away their power. All presidents, both parties, right? And so that's one issue. But that can be nuanced, right? The other is that when presidents get involved politically in negotiations over legislation, it partisanizes things. And that polarization creates a difficulty of getting things passed. So
more?
I think, it does. And I think the Biden administration is waiting, right? They're like chomping at the bit to get into this. But the more that they are, the harder it's going to be to get something passed, because it's going to be perceived to be like the Biden plan, and the Biden plan won't pass in a House that has a lot of people who don't like.
That's why you invite the Speaker of the House to the White House, and that's
so.
why you have a joint conference. And if they don't want to play, then it's like
you play the blame game. Yeah.
Exactly.
Did we just solve the immigration problem?
I think we did. I mean, just bring me to Washington. And
48 hours.
Give me 72 hours so I can sightsee a little bit, and then
get some local delicacies.
Boom.
Right? Yeah, and then you'll be set. I agree. Well, since we solved that problem, let's solve a different problem.
All right.
Let's solve the problem of the Iowa caucuses. The 2024 election, Jeronimo, is upon us. We are literally days away from the Iowa caucus. This is going to be an important test, I think, for Donald Trump. The polling has consistently had him ahead by, high double digits. So he has to put in a good showing here, but he's got some competitors who are really making some tracks, right? You've got Nikki Haley, who has been surging in polling. She put together a massive fundraising number. Just to pull them up here, she put in $24 million last quarter, and that outpaces every other person. That's 83,000 new donors in that period, which is pretty impressive. Yep. The numbers are looking better for her. She did have a bit of a snafu where she said that she was going to compete in the Iowa caucuses, but that New Hampshire, the primary that comes the week after, would correct the Iowa results. Exactly what she meant was kind of unclear, but Iowa took that as an affront because it's easy to offend Iowans, apparently, especially politically. They don't like to be challenged on that. But regardless of all of that, and maybe even regardless of some of the stuff about people asking her questions about why the Civil War persisted, why it started, things like that, and she had an answer that did involve slavery, which is the most obvious answer, she has been moving ahead. So, like I said, I think Trump really needs to have a good showing here. I'm not sure they will, because in terms of organization, in terms of money, in terms of impact, they simply have just been coasting on their lead. Do you think that there's a chance here for an upset? And what would that look like?
I mean, I don't know if there's going to be an upset. I mean, if we base our decision or analysis based on the polls, I would say absolutely not.
Yeah.
But, these are polls.
No, and it's a caucus.
It's a caucus,
so
exactly.
People have to show up. And,
right.
It's cold in Iowa.
Right.
It's likely to be like in the single digits, which is unfathomable for us in Texas. Right. But it could snow also, which makes it hard for people to get to the polls or to the caucuses. So that could create some complications.
Yeah, no. So it's, it's decision time. It's game day. You need to have your quarterback ready, all the offense ready, defensive teams, special teams ready. Yeah. And as you say, I haven't seen too much of a traction in Iowa, especially on the groundwork, especially from the Trump campaign. Yeah. So we're going to see if he delivers or not delivers. As you say, I think he needs a solid win.
Yeah.
I mean, he needs a double-digit win.
Yeah.
Single digits or close win is going to be very bad, because then you have DeSantis and Haley, ready. They're going to smell blood in the water. And then, boom.
Yeah. No, you're right. And on your kind of football analogy that the team has to be ready to go.
You saw that?
The quarterback of Team Trump is spending time in court.
Yeah.
And so we'll talk about that in a second. But obviously, to me, that creates a real problem where you've got Nikki Haley out knocking on doors. You've got Ron DeSantis who's like in diners talking to people. You've got some of the other rivals who are not, making debates and aren't, polling really high like Vivek Ramaswamy, but they're definitely out there fighting too, and to some degree fighting for the same voters, right?
Yep.
Like some of the Trump supporters may decide that we haven't seen Trump, the legal problems are a real issue. Game day decision, I'm going to go with Team Haley instead, right? Or Team DeSantis. So the polling doesn't suggest that's the case, but he's not doing himself any favors, right? He's making speeches about how he'd be a dictator and and how these rambling kind of campaign events that he's kind of known for. Maybe people find it endearing, but also creates problems for him. So as a legal question, as a political question, he definitely is going to have to, suit up in a better way, right?
Yep.
I don't know what get the helmet on tighter, strap that chin guard down a little bit.
Buy the mouth guard.
Buy the Lord.
I don't know.
Yeah, well, something, because otherwise you spend most of your time in court, which is where he's been. So Donald Trump this week traveled to Washington, D.C. to appear for an appeals court hearing about the case in terms of his prosecution about efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Basically, the question here is whether or not the president is immune from prosecution for actions that he took while in office. This is a Trump question, but it's also a bigger question about what the president's immunity looks like after they leave office. We've never had a president who's been indicted after they've left office. So this is all kind of really new territory. So the appeals court's going to have to kind of tease this out. Now, Trump's argument basically in his legal argument is that because he was president, he's immune from these questions.
Period.
But the prosecution's argument basically is that this extended claim of immunity has never been something that's been extended to presidents. It's never been relied upon. So some of the dynamics of this are really interesting. You've got the lawyers for Trump answering questions about what would exactly consider a qualified immunity or full immunity here. Like, for instance, if you had the Navy SEAL team sent to execute a political rival, would that be something that would be coverable from this sort of blanket immunity that the Trump team is claiming? And what the Trump lawyer said was, well, if they had been sort of prosecuted from Congress, impeached, and Congress had given them the final okay, then it would be okay, because then you'd have like a verified outcome. That didn't strike the justices as being very fair or kind of consistent with the rule of law. So those kind of questions to me are really interesting here. And I think to me the biggest kind of conundrum that the courts face is how broad to make the blanket immunity. They could make it very broad in the way that the Trump legal team is saying, like, whatever the president did while in office, they can get away with it. Or they can have a much more narrow version of it, so that things that don't cross other kind of criminal statutes can be considered immune, but beyond that, maybe not. So there are lots of ways they can parse this. But
right.
the politics of this are really stunning. And that's what I want to ask you is like, what do you think this means for 2024? Here's a president under indictment saying they can do effectively anything they want, including and up to assassinating political rivals.
Right.
So assuming they don't get caught and Congress doesn't object, but when would a Republican Congress object to a Republican president killing a political rival? I don't want to even go there, but that's the question that we confront. So what do you think this means politically for the president, former president?
Oof, I guess, I don't know. I mean, because if, these appeal courts, and eventually it's going to go to the Supreme Court, decides that, yes, indeed, the president has blanket immunity while empowered to do whatever they want, unless, right, a partisan country, a partisan body, which is Congress, determines if it is an impeachable offense or not, based on a definition of high treason and misdemeanors that is vague in itself, right? It's going to create havoc. That is, basically democracy would be dead.
It's a stunning point, actually, because then what you would have is a Congress who would have to stop the president at every action to say, we're going to officially sanction you for this action, because in the event later on we want to prosecute you for it, we have to have some kind of record here.
Exactly.
So it would basically clog up the politics of Washington all the time.
Oh, yeah, and we're going to spend our time playing impeachment, right?
Impeaching everything for every reason.
And we have seen that. We're seeing it today,
Maybe
right?
We're not far from
because it's the weaponization of tit for tat for impeachment, and frankly, that's going to stop the whole process and everything else.
Yeah, it's a great point. No, I think you're right. We'll see how this plays out, because politically this could be damaging for the former president. It's the one major liability that he faces, so we will see. But in the meantime, let's talk Texas. This is party politics. I'm Brandon. This is Jeronimo. Obviously, there's a lot going on in Lone Star State. We're heating up with primaries. But before we get to that point, maybe even feeding this to some degree, is a lawsuit from DOJ. The Department of Justice has filed a lawsuit against the state of Texas, alleging that the new immigration law essentially is unconstitutional. Basically, the law, which is set to take place in effect in March, gives local police the authority over immigration enforcement, and it's faced criticism about the potential to lead to racial profiling. There have been isolated incidents where people have reported this to be true already. It also allows for a judge to order an undocumented person to return to the nation from which they entered. There's a lot of thorniness here. This is obviously an attempt to try to overturn prior law, which the Supreme Court has said it was limited. Texas wants to lead the way on this. You have a lot of politicians here who would love to see that as a feather in their cap. You're an expert on this stuff. What do you think is going to happen here in terms of the kind of border security issues?
Well, I think, this is clearly a federal prerogative, right? Immigration policy is a federal prerogative.
You think the courts will agree?
I think the courts have to agree, and there is enough jurisprudence and enough cases before we have Arizona SB 1070 before that has been ruled like, you cannot do that kind of stuff. So I think, the courts have, in my opinion, based on jurisprudence, based on the Constitution, the proper clause, etc., it's clear that they have it. But once again, it creates more pressure for the Biden administration, and especially for Congress, because Congress is the one that changes law. It's not the president. So here, Republicans and Democrats are at fault. And I think that if Governor Abbott wants to really have a change, he needs to start pressuring, at least the Texas delegation and all the border governors to pressure the delegations to say, okay, now we have come to the point that we need to change these things. So we'll see
how it goes. Yeah, but DOJ getting involved in this definitely is part of that process, right? Like, it's as much as a legal question, it's also a political question. So you're going to have a lot of these primary fights, which we'll talk about over the next couple of weeks, centering on these questions, right? How far to the right can you go on border security? But the tension, the fights, the battle inside the GOP isn't just about immigration. It's also about Ken Paxton.
Yes.
So we talked last year about this ongoing conflict from the Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and the Speaker of the House Dade Phelan about the conflict and the impeachment of Ken Paxton, the Attorney General. It ultimately led to Ken Paxton's acquittal, but the cost of it is still in dispute. So just this week, you had the Lieutenant Governor attempting to continue to put political pressure on the Speaker by saying that he is slippery Dade and telling him that he needed to essentially agree to this audit, which would tell the state how much money the House spent. The Senate says they spent roughly $500,000 on this. So how much did the House spend? Do you think this is going to be an issue that the lieutenant governor, who clearly didn't make a news resolution to make new friends, is going to change the dynamics in primaries?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
So we're going to see that tension being, transpired in the primary election. And we have had, those that support Ken Paxton, and then the governor has endorsed some, the lieutenant governor has endorsed some, the Speaker of the House. Yeah. So it's just, all front battle, like WWE, remember, with everybody in the ring.
The battle royale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Battle royale. So
get
we're
a
going
chair,
to see. Exactly.
Get a piece of wood.
Yeah. We're going to see what's going to happen.
Exciting. Well, inside the GOP battle is not going to be the only battle. We're also going to see lots of battles between Republicans and Democrats, and one is going to be in South Texas. This is going to be an interesting race here. And some of the events of the week kind of lend some interest to this. Former GOP Congresswoman Mayra Flores, who's running for her old seat in South Texas, is accused of stealing photos from other social media accounts and from other news magazines and passing them off as her own cooking. Yep. So people have dubbed this Grubgate. Now, she's basically using these pictures, saying it's her own homemade food. So her opponent, Representative Vicente Gonzalez, says that she's the George Santos of the Rio Grande Valley. What do you think? Is this going to matter to voters?
I mean, yes and no, right? I mean, sure. But as you said, scandals are death. Yeah. But, we saw what happened with George Santos, right? So it might hurt, because what voters want is authenticity, right? And
I think that's totally right. Yeah,
and that's exactly what they're asking for. Yeah. So we're gonna see if that's gonna be the case or not, and if Grubhub and stealing some enchilada pictures are gonna have an important point.
I know you would never do that. When you send me pictures of food, I assume it's food that you've cooked. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. It always looks stunning, so it looks like it should be like in a magazine, but it's your actual.
Absolutely,
cooking,
100%. Thank you for the filters on the phones.
Yeah, that's right.
But we're gonna leave it with an empty stomach, and that's it for this week. I'm Jeronimo Cortina.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus. The conversation keeps up next week.